Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. If you remember from the last video that we covered here about the Vietnam War, I ended it on the My Lai Massacre, and I ended it on the division of Americans in the United States with regards to their support or not support of this war. So this is what we're going to get into here when we talk about the end of the Vietnam War. So now you have growing numbers of Americans who began to criticize this war. Remember what I said about the My Lai Massacre. What kind of barbarians have we become over there that we're just massacring civilians of Vietnam? College students are the ones who are leading these protests, like the Students for a Democratic Society. And by the end of 1968, 75% of college or universities or college campuses had been sites for anti-war demonstrations. It is the young college students who are leading this charge against the war. We're covering this because it's important about what happens for Richard Nixon. All right, so just remember that. Some Americans held demonstrations of support of the war, but they were kind of silent. It is these college students that are the ones who are being vocal. They are the ones that are out there. They are the ones that are protesting, making things happy. During the 1960s, I'm sure you've heard of this, you have Americans developing a counterculture, and these Americans were calling the hippies. They believed in their own values, their own ways of behaving. They would emphasize individual freedoms, nonviolence, communal sharing. They would grow long hair. They would wear tie-dyed clothes, unusual clothing for the time. That's a picture of some hippies right there on your bottom right there. All right, this is what's going on in the 60s now. Pro-war and the anti-war demonstrations are now creating like a counterculture of Americans. Remember, American men never grew their hair long and wore long clothes and bell bottoms and listened to peace music, man, individual love and freedom. Right? That wasn't the way America was. But now this counterculture is coming from this. And remember, this is the young, the college age students, the ones who are fighting for this freedom, trying to rebel against what their parents were. The 1950s parents, the whole suburban America, white American mass consumption of consumer goods. We're going to go against that. Two things that we're going to cover here again. Kent State University rioted and destroyed property in the protest. Now, this is college in Ohio called Kent State University. And the governor of Ohio sends the National Guard to maintain the order at this protest at Kent State University. Well, you have the students who are throwing things and getting angry, and the National Guard, and the tension is high. You have weapons and not weapons, and the guard and the students are yelling at each other and fighting. And at one point in time, several of these soldiers opened fire on the college students, killing 4 of them and wounding several others. And this becomes known as the Kent State Massacre. So when we're talking about a massacre, you don't have to necessarily talk about thousands of people dying, hundreds of people dying. It's just the armed against the unarmed, right? So at Kent State now, people are like, oh my gosh, our military, our National Guard is firing upon our own citizens and killing our own citizens about this war. There's nothing good coming out of this war. And we covered the My Lai Massacre briefly. Right? In 1968, American soldiers opened fire on several hundred women and children in the tiny town of My Lai. This is an example of what this war was doing to soldiers who were killing innocent people in Vietnam. What do you say about that? Right? Now, the soldiers were under intense pressure. They've been fighting over there for years now. I mean, they've been getting sneak attack, booby trapped, buddies dying all over the place, people getting shot. I mean, but it's inexcusable. You can't do that. But this is what war was doing to our soldiers. Remember, they were 18 to 21 years old. They were young people over there fighting this war. In 1968, when this is all going downhill, President Lyndon Johnson says, I am not running again. I'm out. I'm done. So the Democrats for the ticket were Vice President Hubert Humphrey and John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, from New York. Robert Kennedy unfortunately gets assassinated. Hubert Humphrey winds up winning the Democratic ticket, but violence over the war that broke out at the Democratic Convention after police tried to stop the anti-war demonstrations, and Hubert Humphrey's chances of winning the president are done. The Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, he's the guy that wins the presidency, and he promises to restore order to society and bring an end to Vietnam with peace and honor. Remember what he said. Nixon actually wins the presidential election of 1968. And what happens next? So that guy on the top right, that was Nixon's national security advisor, and his name is Henry Kissinger. And they have this plan that they're going to pull out of Vietnam, and they call it Vietnamization. This strategy of Vietnamization was basically the United States Army training the South Vietnamese Army to fight the North Vietnamese Viet Cong. And once we train them to fight, we'll leave, right? So that's the idea. And Americans are okay with that. So, all right, you train them, and once they're trained, we're out. Sounds good, President Nixon. You're the man. However, Nixon promotes and proposes the idea of Vietnamization. And instead of doing that, he actually lengthens the war, because without Congress's knowledge and without telling the American people, he approves bombing of Cambodia and Laos to try to disrupt the Viet Cong lines, right? Remember, we had a deal that we were not going to go into Laos or Cambodia. That was the deal. And now Nixon is saying, go into Laos and Cambodia. So they bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They are sending forces into Laos and Cambodia. Now, the forces over there in Vietnam, they're kind of down with that. They're like, this is what we've been waiting for. We've been waiting to get in there and destroy this Ho Chi Minh Trail and get rid of the Viet Cong. President Nixon does not want to be the first president of the United States to lose a war. He doesn't want to pull out. He doesn't want to say, tuck his tail between his legs and be like, we're done. That's just not what American presidents do. We are not going to lose. We are America. We are number one. If we lose, if we pull out of Vietnam, we're just going to go ahead and say that communism won and we're done. So Nixon on one side is saying, yes, we're going to pull out of Vietnam. We're going to train their soldiers, Vietnamization. On the other side, he's saying, I am not going to lose this war. We are going to bomb Laos and Cambodia. We are going to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we are going to win this war. You can't do both as president of the United States. It just cannot happen. So on April 30th, 1970, Nixon announced to the United States that troops were sent to Cambodia to attack these communist bases. The troops never made it to their target. The target was only like 10 miles in. That's all they had to go. It was about 10 miles in there to destroy it. Now, they found lots of little pockets of Vietnamese, Northern Viet Cong camps that had tons of food, like bags and bags and bags of rice, and they had tons of weapons just ready to move into South Vietnam. So they knew what was happening, what was going to happen in South Vietnam. It was not good. So instead of shortening the Vietnam War, it looked like Nixon was actually making the Vietnam War longer. And what happens here? Students protest all over the country about this. Remember, it is the students that are fighting against Nixon and the war. And this is crazy. In June of 1971, the Pentagon Papers are released. They're published, sent to the public, that for years, the United States, the government, has been lying to the American public about the war's progress. All the mistrust and thinking of the government as being like spies and liars, and you cannot trust the president or Congress, stems from this moment right here. Up until this moment, right? Americans trusted our president. It was the highest office. We held respect for it. I mean, sometimes they did some bad things, but it was like, that was the president. We've always had issues with the presidency and people saying things about it, but the real idea that the president and the government lied to us on a daily basis is because of these Pentagon Papers, saying that for years we were winning and we weren't. This intensifies the anti-war feelings. Now, how can you say that we were winning but we weren't? Nixon, Johnson, they kept telling the American people, we are winning this war. Because, and I said in one of my other videos, they were fighting this war via death rates. There were more Viet Cong dying than American soldiers. So we had to be winning this war. That's what they were telling the American people. However, the reality of it was, yeah, there were more of them dying, but we were not winning this war. So remember I said previously, I said these guys were 18 to 21 years old and they couldn't vote, but they could sure fight in a war. Well, now the voting age is lowered to 18 years old. It goes from 21 to 18 in 1971. Why is this a big deal? people, the college students 18 to lower 21s, did not support Nixon. Over 21, the majority supported Nixon. And Nixon wins the presidential election by a landslide. Why? Because of what we call Nixon's silent majority, and we'll get into that. On January 27, 1973, the U.S. signed a ceasefire. It's not a victory, it's not a loss, it's a ceasefire with Vietnam called the Paris Peace Accords. The U.S., the North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong agree that the United States will withdraw all the troops, and the North Vietnam agreed to return all the prisoners of war, the POWs that they've been holding in North Vietnam and torturing in North Vietnam in places called like the Hanoi Hilton. They were torturing our prisoners of war, right? So we signed this Paris Peace Accords, ceasefire, not a win, not a loss, but we're pulling out of Vietnam. Despite the peace agreements, and we knew this was going to happen, that between North and South Vietnam in 1974, fighting broke out again. The United States refused to send troops. We can't do it. It would destroy Nixon's presidency. And the U.S. goal of containing communism is officially a failure. Again, do we lose Vietnam? Technically, no. We signed a ceasefire. Did we win Vietnam? Absolutely not. We signed a ceasefire. So what is the effect or the impact on Southeast Asia? About 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war. About 1 million Viet Cong and Northern Vietnamese soldiers were killed. An estimated 2 million civilians were killed. Look at those numbers, 3.25 million. Remember that. North Vietnamese forces capture Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, in 1975, and they create not the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and they name it Ho Chi Minh City. Communist dictators take over Laos and Cambodia. What about the United States? 58,000 Americans were killed, 300,000 were wounded. 3.25 million Vietnamese killed, 58,000 Americans killed. That's why they were saying we were winning the war. Returning American soldiers were not always welcomed, right? And a lot of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The War Powers Act in 1973 passed requiring the president to now get congressional approval before committing U.S. troops to an armed struggle. No longer can the president just say, go ahead and go. The Vietnam War Veterans Memorial, a wall with all 58,000 men who died in the Vietnam War. Their name is immortalized on this wall, dedicated in 1982 because of the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War was fought to contain communism, and it failed.